It's all yours, SFT.
Thanks so much, guys. We are live tonight on Standing for Truth. We've got a fun stream tonight. We've got some good people as well with us. It's just going to be a bunch of creationists demolishing the philosophy of evolutionism. It's also the coronavirus edition. I know there's been a few people interested in our thoughts and our opinions on it, and just kind of go over the facts, not just the coronavirus, but also viruses in general. There's been a lot of questions such as, why did God create viruses? Why do viruses exist? Were they part of the original creation? So we're going to have a lot of fun tonight. I definitely want to show everybody that what they thought they knew about viruses is wrong for the most part. Because when people think virus, what do they think? They think something bad. But the fact is, and Matt and I were talking about this the other day for a great deal of time, that most viruses are actually beneficial. And people often ask, don't most viruses cause disease? But the answer is actually no. And what the facts are is that you can go swimming in the ocean, for example, and the fact is you've actually been swimming in an ocean full of bacteria. There are actually more viruses than bacteria, and these viruses are actually controlling and regulating the amount of bacteria not only in the ocean but also in our bodies. Because the people in the stream here, they've probably heard that we have more bacteria in and on our bodies than we do actual cells. I mean, we have trillions and trillions of cells and even more bacteria. But what a lot of people don't know is that we have even more viruses than we have bacteria. I think it was, Matt, what was it, 250 trillion viruses in and on our body?
Yeah, even more. I think it was up to 360 trillion. Yeah.
Well, what are all these viruses doing, right? They're controlling the number of bacteria in our gut and the number of species of bacteria. This is all about regulation. So the viruses are regulating the number of bacteria, and without bacteria in our bodies, without bacteria in the ecosystem in the oceans, for example, you might not even want to swim in the water, because what's there going to be? There's going to be an imbalance taking place in the ecosystem. So the point is, most viruses are highly beneficial and incredibly important. Now, not all viruses are good though, but most of them are. This is where we get into, obviously, the influenza virus or the coronavirus. What are some of the thoughts you guys have on those types of viruses, the ones that are actually bad and leading to disease?
Now, if your video is only like 30 seconds, maybe if you can send the other link, maybe if it's a longer video.
No, I think Neff just wants it playing in the background, something to look at.
Oh, I got
Well,
you.
I mean, I just, you said there would be a window that you could put it in and just have something running all the time. I just thought I'd send you that, and if you liked it enough, you could put it in there. If not,
Oh, I got you. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
No biggie. It doesn't matter. It's a video of one of the types of DNA repair.
Cool.
Yeah, so what are your thoughts? Like, for example, Matt, what are your thoughts on, viruses in general, if you want to elaborate on what I talked about. I know there are a lot of creationists that have actually made the case. You can look on creation.com, Dr. Robert Carter, for example. He's brilliant, but they've made the case that viruses we see today have actually been created in us by cellular parts, right? Because cells are packaging things in a variety of ways, and then oops, they've accidentally packaged something that is exactly what a virus is. So it's quite possible that viruses, for the most part, actually came from our genetics. And that's a lot different than what most people think of. I mean, we know we have what look like viruses in our genome. For example, the retrotransposons and endogenous retroviruses, which we now know play incredible functional roles in our genetics. But if we're going to get to the coronavirus, for example, obviously there's a problem there, because the coronavirus is leading to disease. It's not beneficial by any means. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, they've actually been tracking viruses, and they tracked a fast observed mutation rate based on their sites when they looked at it. So what they wanted to do is see how far back, for example, HIV goes. So what they did is they started obtaining the studies on the trio-based studies, and they obtained a 220 generation start point. So if you go back, let's say 20 years per generation, you get what? Around 4,400 years. What does that line up to? Right at Noah's flood. So I find it pretty ironic that the virus that they tracked has a young shelf life, that's brand new. Matter of fact, in 1918, the H1N1 virus hit, and it was a pandemic that went worldwide. And guess what? Today, that virus is going extinct in about 100 years later. It's almost wiped out. It's wiped itself out. Well, that was a very similar virus to what we have today when it comes to the coronavirus, because it has an exponential growth rate. Meaning, if you normally have a cold or a flu and you walk into a room and there's a room full of 10 people, you'll infect about 1 out of those 10. The coronavirus has about 2.5 people per room. So it's an exponential growth factor. The good thing about it, though, is the virus isn't very strong. So even though it's mixed with a reptilian and a mammal, it's not very strong. And it really only kills people with a weak immune system or the elderly. And it doesn't really affect kids. And I'll tell you why. Inside of us, we have natural inflammatory modulators that are built into us. And as we age, we get more of them. They're called cytokines. But young kids don't have very many of these, because obviously they don't go under very much traumatic stress and inflammation in their bodies. So as we get older, we're under more environmental stressors. And what happens is we get more bombarded by infections and sickness and danger and harm. So we get more inflammatory responses. So the body reacts by creating more cytokines as we age. But when we get infected with the coronavirus, these cytokines aren't in very high numbers when we're young. So that's why it's not killing young people. It's killing older people, because they have a huge cytokine reaction, and it's called a cytokine storm. And that's what causes the people to die. So they actually go out and they start taking different herbs, and it actually raises their inflammatory response. And that's not what they want. So it's pretty ironic. So we have a fast mutation or a slow mutation rate as well. They found that a cold mutates about 10 times per year. That's why every year people go get an inoculation or a vaccination for a new flu shot, whereas the coronavirus only mutates 2 times per year. So it's not going to be much of a problem. For example, if they ever come out with a cure, it'll last forever. So that's good.
So so if there are certain herbs and supplements that you're saying are actually negative, like not a good thing to take for the coronavirus, what types of supplements and herbs, Matt, vitamins, would you recommend in order to boost our immune system and actually give us the necessary defense for something like the coronavirus?
Good question. I wrote an article on that one, because a lot of people are going to the grocery store now, and they're loading up on the supplements that they can find to boost their immune system. And one of these is called elderberry, and that's the dangerous one right now, because that specifically raises what's called like ID-10, and it's an interleukin, and basically what it does is it causes that inflammatory response to occur. So you don't want elderberry, especially if you're older. Well, we're younger, so we don't really have to worry, because even if we do get infected, we don't have to really worry about it killing us. We just have to worry about older people actually getting it and dying from it. So they're the ones that would actually have to be considerate of what not to take, because obtaining it isn't the problem. Like I said, it's going to pass through the society pretty quick because of how fast its transmission rate is. So it'll spread really quick for about the next month, and then it should vanish. So what they need to be doing is just taking the most simplistic combinations of things that there are, like consuming ginger and taking most fruit, because lots of vitamin C that'll act as a natural antihistamine. It'll help with reactions, so we don't have bad counterindications. Like, don't run out and buy all these different things. What they did find, though, was a natural herb. It was nettle root. Nettle root was found to be very, very good. There's a particular lectin that's in nettle root, and when you consume that, it seems to have the opposite reaction of the cytochrome storm. So, like, let's say that you're 65 and older, and you want to really concentrate on what to take. Don't really worry about oh, I need to start doing all these different things. It's what you're going to stop doing that's really going to help you. So one of the best things that you can do, though, is nettle root. And it's
nettle root.
Yes, you can cheap and you can buy it everywhere. And that's really good for anybody over 65. So that's really good.
It's interesting that you mentioned like elderberry, for example, is not a good thing, that it would actually exacerbate these symptoms or just make it worse for the coronavirus. Because typically when I'm feeling sick or I feel like I'm coming down with a cold, I'll take elderberry and ginger and oregano and these types of vitamins to overcome it. And, it seems to work. So this coronavirus then must be, it's obviously it's a variation of the cold virus, but it's a little different if certain vitamins or supplements like elderberry are not effective for it, right?
Right. It's a very unique strain, meaning it's a combination of two things that really should never have been there. What happened is probably a bat got eaten by a snake, and then somebody in China ate the snake, because it's a combination of two viral infections of a cold-blooded reptilian and a warm-blooded mammal. So that's a weird infection, right? Like H1N1 that was wiping out like almost the entire world in 1918. That was just an avian flu. That was from a bird, and that was just a mammalian, right? This is a combination of two things. So it's a very strange strain, and that's probably why it's interacting very strange. Usually what happens when you get an infection, you want to take anti-inflammatories because they help. This one exacerbates the issues with inflammatory, and it causes the storm, we'll call it, to go inside the body. And when you're older, you do not want that storm to occur, because that's what's killing people.
What about aspirin, Matt? Aspirin is an anti-inflammatory. Would it be a negative to take aspirin if you contract corona?
No, because it doesn't work as specifically as a cytokine does. So that would be safe.
Well, it's interesting because I've seen some. I think it's Motrin, ibuprofen. I've read some articles that's actually counterintuitive or to coronavirus as well. Have you heard anything like that, Matt?
Yeah, it's because most of them are dealing exactly with anti-inflammatory reactions, and most of them across the board raise all anti-inflammatory markers. And that's not normally bad, except for, in particular, there's one that you do not want to raise. And that's and so if they raise every anti-inflammatory marker, that's when you get the actual problem. So you don't want a broad spectrum anti-inflammatory right now. That's why you just don't go out and buy a bunch of herbs that are multi-spectrum anti-inflammatory. If any, you can stick to systemic enzymes. But like I said, this is a time when it's only affecting 65 and older, and they just need to go out and get the best one there is, and that's nettle root right now from the research that was done.
But you're also saying lots of vitamin C.
Yes.
What about like water with lemon and lime and things like that, like other ways of getting your vitamin C? Like, would you recommend that approach?
Yeah, absolutely. Any way you can get those in. Vitamin C is actually what we want at all times of the body. Remember, it's water soluble, so you're just going to get rid of it as the day goes on. So just constantly keep flushing yourself with vitamin C, because our cells require it, and it requires it every single day. And most people just never really get it. So it's no more important the time than right now.
Well, it's interesting because, like we talked about at the start of this stream, viruses for the most part are beneficial, but like these bad viruses, for example, you were talking about how the coronavirus would have jumped from one species into another, and now into humans. So now the human species, we don't have the ability to regulate the virus properly, and now that virus tends to burn hot and fast. But like you were talking about with the H1N1 in 1918, the Spanish flu, I believe, fortunately, these viruses tend to burn out, which I think it was the case with Ebola as well, right?
Right.
Yeah, so it's the question, that we get often, why would God create something like a virus? Well, for one, the majority of them are beneficial. Where do the bad viruses come from? Why did God create a virus such as coronavirus that seems to be designed to kill people? Well, most viruses were created beneficial, or I'd say at least neutral in the kinds that they were created for. But when they jump species, like you were talking about with this coronavirus, they can go from good to bad. I mean, you can look at swans, you can look at ducks, geese, and the influenza viruses that they carry. They carry all the variations of the influenza virus, believe it or not. And when these animals, defecate in the water, and then you go swimming in the water, you are actually covered in viruses. It's kind of gross to even think about, but what are the beneficial roles of these viruses in, say, the ducks and the geese that isn't so beneficial for us? But I think the point to be made, and the point to take from this for anyone in the audience, generally viruses don't actually cause disease, but when they jump from a different species, like we talked about, the new species does not have the ability to regulate the virus properly, and that's when that virus, like the coronavirus here, is burning hot and fast. So anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think about what most of the viruses have come from. They've come from a cross-mutated species, like mad cow disease, right? That's from cat eating. Somebody ate a cattle, and
Right.
the swine flu that came from pig. The H1N1 that was from a bird. Everyone came from an animal, so got to be careful on that. But here's a good tip for the people: like, they think they're going to go out and they're going to really help themselves. This is what will cause somebody that's young to actually die, that only has a few amount of the cytokines, right? Because you don't want to have too many of them. So what you can do to exacerbate the issue is exactly what most people are doing. They're taking their CBD oil, they're taking oregano oil, they're eating cinnamon, they're having licorice, black curcumin seed, they eat mustard and garlic and echinacea. All of those are very popular. All of those raise cytokines and cause it to be worse. So
it's interesting because it's almost counterintuitive to what a lot of people would think, right? Get as many anti-inflammatory type nutrients in your body and fight it. But you're saying that it's the cytokines that you're talking about, that when there's the presence of too many of them is actually negative to this virus.
That's why they found children aren't dying, because when you're really young, like up until 12 years old, they almost have those cytokines because they haven't replicated enough yet as we get older, right? So that's why no kids are dying. So they found what's happening in the elderly. They have a ton of cytokines. And then when they get the disease, the body starts reacting by giving it off an anti-inflammatory response, and the cytokines start reacting. Basically, cytokines are like different cells in the body that are creating new cells, and these new cells are replicating. These are the cytokines, and that's what's causing the cytokine storm. So there are things that are very good for, like olive leaf and ginger and turmeric. Everybody, like, those are really good to take. But like I said, you just have to know what herbs to do, and most people don't. And they're just running out and they're buying anything that's anti-inflammatory. And this is not the time to do that right now, because you could be really bad. Matter of fact, Joe Rogan had a podcast just the other day, and he had a friend of his that's an Olympic athlete, and he's training, and he's riding a bicycle every day, and he's only 50, right? And so he's in great shape. He's training every day. He's training for the Olympics, and he's on a respirator in the hospital, unable to breathe on his own right now.
Wow.
So obviously he did something entirely wrong. One, you shouldn't be overly training right now because you need your immune system. You can't be taxing your body so much where there's no immune system left to rebuild. when you're an athlete like that, there's almost no good immune response anymore because your body's so depleted trying to rebuild itself that your immune system's a little compromised. So I'm guessing this guy was probably some triathlete riding his bike, and he got the coronavirus, and it attacks your lungs first, right? So it attacked his lungs, and he was an athlete, and look what happened to him. So you got to be careful.
Now, would you say that this one, much like the H1N1 in 1918, because we know that the H1N1, it's actually a prime example of genetic entropy, but it went from a red hot pandemic to a whimper to an extinction event. It burned out because, I mean, these RNA viruses, and correct me if I'm wrong, they have very high mutation rates. They can mutate extremely quickly,
right,
and they replicate quickly. They have, high generation times. In the world of genetic entropy, that's why viruses are important to look at, because we can see if they're going to burn out. But we've seen that with the H1N1. Is that what we're going to see with this one as well, Matt?
Yes, but unfortunately, it's got to make its rounds. Like I said, it's an exponential growth, so
Right.
it's going to spread everywhere. Really, really good. But the good thing is, it's not like H1N1. People died by the masses. I think like 1/3 of the world died from H1N1. It was incredible.
Yeah, I think it was like 50 million.
Yeah, insane. But this one will spread just as fast, but it doesn't have the high death rate. And
Right.
you don't have to worry about it mutating. See, the normal danger of a virus is that it mutates and becomes worse. The mutation rate of this one is so slow, we don't really have much to worry about. So that's a good thing.
So, and from my understanding, there are many sequences of this virus that are documented and can be looked at. So we'll see, I guess, how it changes, how it mutates. We'll be able to look at that over the course of time. It's tough to say right now. But I mean, this virus is a virus, like you iterated earlier, Matt, that jumped from its originally created arena. And this is looking at it from a biblical perspective and really a scientific perspective. But it jumped from its original environment and is now in a brand new environment or field. And this new field is what is called humans. And our immune systems at this point, we just don't know how to deal with it. So viruses in general, I guess, is what we're getting at, is perfectly consistent with a biblical creation worldview. It fits it a lot better than an evolutionary worldview, because we know that viruses for the most part are beneficial. And when you get these bad viruses, well, we know why that happens as well. It's due to the fall. It's due to genetic degeneration. So yeah, any Christian that has a question such as that, or maybe they're just confused as to why certain things like this happen in our world, it's just evidence of the fall and our need for a savior at the end of the day.
Nice. Yeah, matter of fact, if you guys know that in Australia, it's illegal to eat bat because they get a very similar type of coronavirus there. They've been getting it for decades. It's against the law to eat bat in that country.
Because it should be. I mean, just look at what, just look at what happens.
Yeah.
They're very filthy creatures. They live in tight communities, all brushing up against each other when they sleep. And, they're just covered with bacteria and virus, just slap covered with them, They're filthy creatures.
Yeah.
And that's why, I think just on the topic of viruses in general, I find it funny when any evolutionist would even bring up, for example, Matt and I were talking the other day, because we know that one of the major lines of evidence that the evolutionists will bring up now is the endogenous retroviruses, or the retrotransposons, right? But many of those so-called, that's what they've named them, and we're stuck with it. But those so-called ancient viral infections are actually good for us. Those things that are called retrotransposons, they jump around in the genome and they can actually turn on and off various types of genes. It's actually, it's amazing complexity. It's evidence of design. And if some of these retrotransposons or the endogenous retroviruses are shared among various species, let's say humans and chimps, for example, it's not evidence of shared ancestry. It's actually evidence of shared design.
I like it.
And you brought up a few good points too about, let's say, the endogenous retroviruses, Matt. Not only their function, but a few other more minute details that kind of just demolishes that argument.
Oh yeah, yeah. ERVs are interesting. I mean, we've been looking at them, and what I see when they bring up ERVs and when you start investigating them, you notice the same genetic decay that's occurring in them. Like they know that we have inside of us 98,000 different ERV, but guess what? They're not whole. These are in bits and pieces throughout the body. So when they go, well, how many are still functional? Guess what? 98,000 is in you right now. Guess how many ERVs are entirely whole? 55. That's it. That's it. Out of almost 100,000. So if they were whole at one point, they've degraded to the point now where they're like junk DNA. That's how they look. They've lost it. That's genetic degradation, even in ERVs inside of us. So,
well, there's even a class of retrotransposons, Matt, that what is it? I believe it's in the mouse embryo, and that if you deactivate it, the mouse embryo will develop and then suddenly stop. And why is this? Well, it's because the mouse embryo depends on the function of these retrotransposons, which these evolutionists, for one, they're trying to use it as evidence for common descent, and two, they always assumed it was what? Just like you said, junk DNA.
Right. Yeah, amazing, right? They imagine trying to tell somebody these are just random viral elements that bound themselves to our species long ago and far away, and they don't really have any function and they don't produce anything. And then we find that they have such a critical function that humans can't even exist without them. And yet they still use them as evidence for evolution. They're insane.
Oh, it's because that's their philosophy. Brother Neff brings that up all the time when they start storytelling. You're looking for the evidence, and they go on a rant, and then you say, yeah, I understand that's what you believe, that's your philosophy, but where's the actual evidence? And it's funny because you'll explain, like I was debating Erica for the second time I debated her, and I enjoyed the debates with her. I have nothing bad to say, but when it came to the rescue device after rescue device that she resorted to, for example, the orphan genes, the endogenous retroviruses, I went over the many known functions of them. You know, they help determine cell types, they help regulate genes, they're important in the placenta. We can go on and on forever. And, you know, not only her, but the evolutionists, they'll admit to these functions, but then they resort to, as you know, Matt, the rescue devices, you know, they've been co-opted. For one, the retroviruses have never actually been observed in real time to have inserted themselves into our DNA. That's just assumed. We only see them in our DNA, and mostly fragments, like you said, right. Let alone see a non-functional endogenous retrovirus go from non-functional to functional.
That's right. And we don't ever see it occurring today. So we have to assume then that it happened. And guess what? We also have human endogenous retroviruses. That's what HERVs are. So we have specific ones. They go, well, that must have just happened after we split from apes. So that's convenient. And then guess what? We investigate those. Those have functions as well. So it's just all storytelling.
Well, we can use those, you know, lineage, those human specific endogenous retroviruses. We can use those. We can use orphan genes. We can use other taxonomically restricted type genes to separate ancestry. You know, those are important to us, but yet the evolutionist, they have to say that, no, these ones that are, you know, specific to the human line or the chimp line, they were inserted independently with no real evidence of the independent insertions.
Right. Exactly. We should give it over to somebody new. Let's introduce Conflict, by the way. He hasn't said anything.
Hey, what's up, guys?
Conflict, my man. Thanks for joining us, brother. Yeah, I want to introduce you to our audience, although they've seen some of your videos as well. Phenomenal work you're doing. So we're happy to have you on this team.
Hey, I'm glad to be here. I appreciate it, and God bless.
What are your thoughts about the religion of fish to fisherman evolution?
Can you say that one more time? I'm sorry.
I'm just asking you, what's your thoughts of the evolutionism in general? You know, do you see it as more of a philosophy or a science fiction religion?
Well, it's faith based. Everything we believe, we have justification for when they talk about things. It's just they have to go and believe these things. There's nothing actually saying, okay, this has been 4.5 billion years. So to me, I think it's just more of an opt out to God.
Right, I completely agree. And that's why I'm always baffled by the theistic evolutionists that want to embrace, that type of large scale evolution. Because, I mean, they kind of hijack the word anyways, evolution, because it just means change, and we believe in change. But if you're actually talking about the overarching, theory, well, it's not even a good theory, the overarching philosophy of evolution stating that everything's related, it's just so contradictory and contrary to God and his word.
Right. And, the devil is, everything opposite of God. So when you really think of it, I mean, we're sitting here, God created everything, and then Satan saying, no, he didn't create anything. We came from rocks and plants and, what have you, whatever they want to believe. So, the devil's very deceiving. And again, I think it's an opt out in most cases. I think me and Ra, we talked about this the other day, how most of the time when you ask them if they would follow God, almost 99.9%, they always say no. It's not just the non-belief of God. It's another religion for them to believe.
Right. That's a great point. You can debate these guys all day, and you can simply ask them the question that if you actually were given the evidence that was absolute proof, would you now decide to be a Christian? And oftentimes, like you said, they say no. There's something about the Bible or something about their personal morality or the way they're living that they have a problem with, because now they're going to have to embrace their sinful nature, and that's
Exactly.
yeah. That's a great point.
And I think it's I've had plenty of debates online, not like this, but just talking with people, trying to get them around, and put the legwork in. Hey, if I could prove this to you, because we have evidence, right? I mean, we can use fossils the same as them. We can use all this other stuff the same as an evolutionist. It's not. There's no stamp on this stuff, right? So they don't own it. They don't
Right.
own anything. It's God's world in the first place, right? So I just think that when you try and show them, they have issues with things in the Bible. What Christian doesn't? We've all read something in the Bible that we were like, wait a minute, I don't know about this.
Right.
But we've had to get around to it. We've had to find out the answers. We've had to dig in deeper. That would just be like an evolutionist saying, wait, this doesn't make sense, and then they're digging into something else, But I don't know. All over, I think, again, it's just it's an irrational thought for them, because if they really wanted evidence, then it's there, right? So if they wouldn't even follow God in the first place, what good is the evidence? And that's my main point, is if it doesn't even matter if God's real or not, why make it all about evidence?
Right. That's a good point, especially in that, and that's what I mean. Like you said, 99.9% of them are going to say, even if they're given the evidence, they're still going to reject the God of the Bible. And that's what we do here a lot too, is in discussions or debates with evolutionists, we'll oftentimes ask, if you were to just put aside your evolutionary bias and assumptions and think critically about what would you actually expect scientifically to find if the Bible was true, if Genesis was true. And they don't want to admit it, but we corner them all the time, because what we do find is evidence for one male ancestor, right, in our Y chromosome, one female ancestor in our mitochondrial DNA. Observed mutation rates take us right back to two original ancestors just thousands of years ago. And it's funny because you ask them that question, in their mind, that's what they're thinking. They're like, yeah, that's what I would expect to find scientifically, and yet that is what we find. But it's not good enough for them.
Right, and I think in some regards, like they talk about hypothesis and whatnot, and that's fine, but you could actually utilize the Bible as hypothesis as well. That it says in the Bible to test things, so you take those words and then you put them to the test. That's how we know it's true. That's what we're supposed to do as Christians. So I don't see any contradictions in there.
No, and you know what? God didn't even have to give us this much scientific evidence, right? It's about faith. Faith cometh by hearing, and hearing by the word of God. And it's the power of the Holy Spirit, and it's where we decide to put our faith and trust at the end of the day. But yet, we're living in a time where, whether it's genetics, geology, astronomy, biology, it all points to not only God, but the God of the Bible.
Absolutely. The truth, the simple truth is, when you step out on your driveway with a cup of coffee in the morning and you see the dragonfly dashing around and you see the leaves blowing in the wind and you see the grass and the crickets jumping, you have every reason to believe there's a creator, because it's common sense that anything this complex, interdependent, and beautiful doesn't arise by natural processes. People spend their whole lives in knowing and observing everything around them decay over time. You bought something when you were a child, you've still got it, you're 40. Look at it now. It's falling apart. If it's made of plastic, it's falling apart, because everything goes downhill. Everybody knows this intuitively, because by experience. And everybody knows intuitively that the creation screams of a creator. Now, you can tell that to an evolutionist and they'll say, no, that's not true. But it really is true. It really is. Just observing this beautiful, marvelous, complex, interdependent world that God has made screams of a creator. And the evolutionist refuses to acknowledge that inference, but it really does smack even the evolutionist in the face. And they strive to not believe it. But it does trouble them, I think. And the evolutionist is their mindset is such that they think that it's really remarkable. They all suffer from a kind of a mental delusion. They think that whatever is in their imagination is scientific evidence. If they can envision something transforming into something else, well, then it must be true that it does. See, that's how they think. They have a presupposition that evolution must be true because the alternative is unacceptable to them. So they presuppose that evolution takes place, everything about it is true. And so if they can imagine, even if they don't have the physical evidence that shows something happening, and they don't, of course, because they can imagine it, well, that means it did. See, that's how the mind of an evolutionist works. What they assume, what they imagine, is scientific evidence to them. And that's why when you're debating evolutionists, many times you can ask them specific questions about things and they'll be unable to give you actual physical evidence for it, but they'll keep telling you it's true. Well, why is that? It's not because they have physical evidence of it. It's because they've already assumed, they presume, that whatever is in their imagination about evolution must be true, therefore it is. And so the evolutionist thinks that their imaginary thoughts about evolution constitute scientific evidence. And this proves that evolution is a philosophy and not science.
Exactly. I think Romans 1:18 through 32, sums up basically everything you just said right there.
Yeah, Romans 1, it actually foretells of evolution theory coming. It's a prophecy. There is a passage there that says that man worshiped creatures which had four-footed beasts and creeping things. And there's two things in there. The Bible is remarkable because sometimes it says two completely different things in one passage, and both of them are true. Give you two kinds of information in the same passage, and that one does that. In one way, it's talking about how in early history, and not long after the Tower of Babel affair, the tribes of man around the world made gods out of creatures. They deified animals. The Egyptians have their god with the falcon head on it, and the Babylonians and Sumerians had theirs, and so they deify creatures, and so they worshipped idols of creatures. So that's one thing it's talking about. But at the same time, it's talking about, think about it, worshiping the creature. So, and that's exactly what evolutionists do. They think the creature is their creator. It was some prior creature that is what made them. And so at the same time, that passage is actually giving us a prophecy of the coming of evolution theory by saying that they're fools for believing that nature, that animal, is what made man, when it's not so.
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah, and I would say that information is just like in the cell. It's also fundamental to the universe. I know people look into that quantum information. So I think there's not even one atom out of place. And you can see the teleology, what what comes with the teleological, it comes with all the inference. So you can see in the cell and in the universe, it all works together. We have an intelligent designer. We don't. And here's another thing too. They make caricatures. Atheists and evolution. They make caricatures of creation, intelligent design. They purport that we believe a God that just did magic and he blew on the dust or something. I mean, something like that, like
Right.
like a fairy tale or something. That's not. We have a medium.
Yeah.
We actually have scientific evidence of God. It's testable, observable. So I think that's another thing I want to point out.
DNA has so thoroughly disproved evolution theory that it's just not even funny. And today evolutionists they're having to strive not to believe it. Let me share with you a quotation from a science article. It was published on phys.org, phys.org, and it's been published elsewhere. And this is some of the new discoveries. It's not exactly new, but extended discoveries that verify that evolution is false because of the properties of DNA. And I'm going to read this, about a paragraph long. It comes from mainstream secular science. They state, a new study from Sweden's Karolinska Institute shows that the grammar of the human genetic code is more complex than that of even the most intricately constructed spoken human languages in the world. The findings published in the journal Nature explain why the human genome is so difficult to decipher and contribute to the further understanding of how genetic differences affect the risk of developing disease on an individual level. The sequences of the human genome in the year 2000 revealed how the 3 billion pairs of letters of A, C, G, and T that the human genome consists of are ordered. However, knowing just the order of the letters is not sufficient for translating the genetic discoveries into medical benefits. And analysis reveals that the grammar of the genetic code is more complex than that of even the most complex human languages. Instead of simply joining two words together by deleting a space, the individual words are joined together in compound DNA words are altered, leading to a large number of completely new words. This is astonishing. The way that DNA handles the words of the genetic information is profound. It's able to create its own words on the fly as needed. And its grammar is more complex than any spoken human language grammar. It's astonishing. And of course, grammar and linguistics proves intelligence because language depends upon something called semiotics, that is, applying meaning to a symbol. the meaning of symbols, and the interpretation of meaning from a symbol. Those are mental processes, not chemical ones. See, so this verifies for us that linguistics is a product of intelligence, not chemical processes. So the information, linguistics, and algorithms of DNA are empirical verification, not just evidence, verification that all living systems are in fact designed by a mind, because the properties of linguistics, algorithms, and information cannot be produced by chemical processes. They're produced by mental ones, and which only arise in intelligence, always. Every example of these arises from intelligence. Matter doesn't imply meaning to itself or interpret meaning from itself. It takes an intelligence to apply meaning to a symbol. You don't. There's no such thing as 1,000 molecules sitting around and having a conference about what they think this symbol ought to mean. And everybody voting on it. That's just nonsensical thinking. And intelligence applies meaning to a symbol or interprets meaning from it. So the biggest challenge in the future of evolution theory is going to come from trying to explain, and already has begun, for trying to explain how information linguistics and algorithms could have arisen by natural processes, especially when they're that complex in the genomes of living things. And evolutionist scientists are all scratching their heads and claiming that it did somehow, but they aren't able to offer a rational explanation as to how that's even possible. So that's one of the greatest challenges to evolution theory now, and it's going to be in the future, is to explain how in the world functional information, prescriptive information, algorithms, linguistics, and grammar could arise by undirected chemical processes. It's a real head scratcher for the evolutionist.
And
Amen,
plus, it's
brother.
digital too.
And that's exactly why in Romans 1, it says, "For the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are," and here's the important part, "without excuse." The evidence is there. The information and complexity in DNA, as Neff just explained, is there. So at the end of the day, when they're standing before God at the judgment seat, they are absolutely 100% without excuse. And the fact that the genome is digital, like Prey said, it's multi-layered, and now the functionality of the genome too, what we know about it, ENCODE and accumulating papers, it's functional on many layers, like literally layer upon layer upon layer of programming within our genetic code. And programming, for one, always requires a programmer. And what we now know about mutations, deleterious mutation accumulation, well, this just means that we're degenerating. So ape to man evolution is impossible because both ape genomes and human genomes have been degenerating. Neff mentioned earlier about things are falling apart. I mean, my house does not just clean itself. The more I let it sit there, my car sit there, it gets more and more dirty. Or when I wake up in the morning, my hair's all over the place. I mean, this is entropy, the second law of thermodynamics, the law of increasing entropy. You take the right now, the entropy we see to a point of least increasing entropy, that's a point of creation. Or take the genetic entropy that we see, the accumulation of deleterious mutations, to a point of least deleterious mutations, right there is a point of creation, Adam and Eve. And we've been degenerating and we've been falling apart ever since.
Yeah.
Right.
That's exactly right. Let me share one more thing with you. Algorithms is another complete refuter for evolution. And I'm going to read another quotation from you. This is from several secular scientists publishing in the Theoretical Biology and Medical Modeling Journal, published in 2012. This is amazing. They state this: An operational analysis of the ribosome revealed that this molecular machine, with all of its parts, follows an order of operations to produce a protein product. The order of operations has been detailed in a step-by-step process that has been observed to be self-executable. The ribosome operation has been proposed to be algorithmic, called an R-algorithm, of linear sequencing, branch, and conditional control. All of these features at because it is shown to be a step-by-step process of process flow allowing for decision control, iterative branching, and halting capability. The R algorithm contains logical structures that of linear sequencing, branch, and conditional control. All of these features meet a minimum definition of an algorithm when combined with the data from the mRNA, satisfy the rule that algorithm equals data plus control. Remember that mere constants cannot serve as a bona fide formal controls. We therefore conclude that the ribosome is a physical grammar of biological systems in a similar manner of how we study computational cybernetic systems. And listen to this statement. These examples define a dichotomy in the definition of prescriptive information. We therefore suggest that the term prescriptive information be subdivided into two categories, etc. And they also state this. What they're saying there, wait, there's one more thing to share on that. They state CCC, where is that? I'm looking for it. Control, let me see here. Well, here it is. They state this. Without such steering of physiochemical interactions by choice, contingent, causation, and control. So they're stating that the ribosome operates by choice, contingent, causation, and control. It makes decisions while it's putting together a protein. If something goes awry, or if it's not the right amino acid in there, it might be able to detect it and change. Or if it's aligned incorrectly, it can modify the alignment of the amino acid and then bond it into place in the chain and keep on going. It has choice contingent controls. I mean, that's computer programming, folks. At the level of a nanotechnology machine called a ribosome that's building a protein. It's got choices built in. It's as if a computer programmer wrote a program that says, make decisions while you're doing this. I mean, where does that come from? That comes from intelligence. Molecules can't decide to make choice contingent control, causation, and control, and they can't write algorithms. So even at the smallest level, the microscopic nanotechnology machines in the cell operate with intelligent design programming language, and they operate with decision making and control mechanisms. That just blows evolution clean out of the water.
I don't even know any programming that can do that from even computer programmers and software makers. I don't even know what software that can do that. That's incredible.
It's impossible because an algorithm requires forward thinking. To write an algorithm, you have to think about what goal you want to achieve and then define a process to achieve it. And matter isn't forward thinking. It doesn't think about the future. All chemical reactions happen in the present. They don't happen in the future. They're not happening in the past. All chemistry happens only in the present. So how can present chemical interactions prescribe a function that ought to take place in the future? They can't. You see, it's impossible. So it is scientifically, chemically impossible for material processes to create an algorithm. And yet they define almost everything that's going on in cells.
And realistically, to have those types of programs, the complexity in our genome that is multi-layered and incredibly superior, Neff, to anything computer science could do today, is in my mind 100% evidence that the genome is designed. But remember, the evolutionists, they try and argue that biological information, the prescriptive information that you're talking about, it's just merely organic chemistry, Neff, and not real information. What do you say to an evolutionist who tells you that, Brother Neff?
Exactly. That's the only way they can deal with it. They say that. I hear it all the time. You're right. They say it's not actually information. That's not really an algorithm. It's not real linguistics
Right.
going on, grammar inside the DNA. But it actually is. They have to say that to deny it, because if they acknowledge it really is, they know they're talking about something designed. And so when they make that erroneous claim that it's not actually information, it's not actually algorithm or linguistics, they just jumped into denial mode and denying the truth, but also denying science. They just denied the discoveries of genetics, and for the purpose of clinging to their philosophy.
Hey, that thing driving down the road sounds like a car, looks like a car. That isn't a car, though, now.
No.
That's
We
right.
just call it a car because it's convenient to do so.
It's funny because the definition of information, I think the best definition of information, and the evolutionists always like to what's your definition? And I think it's functional specificity communicated through language or code. And that's exactly what the information in our genetic code is. Information is information. That's a fact, regardless of the medium. And like you said, when they resort to, biological information is nothing more than organic chemistry, they are now entering science denialism.
That's true. And just look at the root word of the word information, inform. Do molecules have sentience? Do they inform anybody of anything? No, that takes a mind. So the very word information is requires that intelligence. To create information requires intelligence, just based on the very definition of the word inform, right?
Right.
So, SFT, how you gonna address Aaron Ross? What for information? He was like he wanted a standard for information or something. What was his objection to information?
Well, with Aaron Ron and Godless Engineer tried to do the exact same thing to me because he obviously watched Aaron Ra's debate with was it Dr. Grady McMurtry, I believe, where Dr.
Yeah.
McMurtry was going on about how mutations degrade. Even the most beneficial of mutations are reductive. We're losing information. We're going down and not up. And Aaron Ra kept asking, well, how do we measure information loss? What's the unit of measurement for information loss? How do we know? And it's so funny because it's the exact same thing that I said to Godless Engineer. I said, this is when you enter science denialism, okay? For example, there's a type of mutation called a deletion, okay? If you're deleting part of a genome, that should tell you that you're losing information. Deletion means a loss of some kind. And there's paper after paper. For example, there's a paper that talks about how certain populations of Neanderthals were 40% less fit. They were highly inbred compared to humans today. And if you actually read the paper, they go into like gene deletions and things like this to measure the fitness loss. Well, there you go, Aaron Ron. That's a secular paper. And anything, I mean, even speciation, right? When a smaller part of a larger population breaks off, and then their genes go from more heterozygous to homozygous, that's also a loss in information. That's a decrease in allelic variability. I mean, there's so many ways to measure information loss. We accumulate 100 new mutations per person per generation. Those are single nucleotide letter differences. They're mistakes in our genome. A mistake should, evolutionists deny science, but common sense would tell you that a mistake means a loss of some kind. A mistake in a book, a typographical error means a loss in the message. So anytime you hear that praise, just know that it's, instead of addressing the genetic entropy problem, they want to confuse it. Well, they want to try and confuse their audience by asking a silly question like, what is information loss?
Well, all that's a good point. In fact, changes to allele frequencies in populations over time, and genetic variation. When a population produces variety of itself, the evolutionist says this is evolution, and as that process continues over time, you eventually get a fundamentally different type of organism, right? But this is one of the greatest failures of evolution theory, because anybody who works with creatures and breeds them as a scientist and studies them knows that changes to allele frequency in populations, in other words, as creatures produce varieties of themselves generation after generation, there's a continuous loss of genetic information involved, because certain genes will become turned off, or they'll become recessive, and eventually they get turned off permanently and can't be expressed anymore. And that's the opposite of what evolution requires. Evolution requires a constant input of new information, but what science proves to us is, as creatures create increased varieties of themselves, they're losing information. It's the exact opposite of what you must have for evolution to be true. And so evolutionist scientists are absolutely in denial of what science has revealed to us genetically about increased populations or genetic variation in populations. And yet they're going to still go about telling you that's the mechanism of evolution, when they know for a fact it does the opposite, because it reduces genetic viability by reducing the genome, by turning off genes in a population, which is exactly how you get a Chihuahua from two dogs. You
Right.
get one not by not by creating new information, by turning off genes. You turn off the gene that makes it big. You turn off the gene that gives it a long tail. You turn off the genes that give it lots of hair. And eventually you get some defunct, ugly looking critter that can't hardly do anything, because you're losing information. And that's one of the greatest failures of the evolution theory, because they keep saying that variation over time is what creates fundamentally new, different creatures. But science shows us the opposite. As variety increases of a creature over time, you endlessly, constantly lose genetic information. And so that is one of the most obvious failures of the evolution theory in the modern time.
But it's
Right.
absolutely genius points you bring up, Def. I mean, it comes down to allelic potential, allelic variability. I mean, you can get two wolves and in 100 years breed every single dog you have today. But like your Chihuahua, a cute dog, of course, but I mean, take all the Chihuahuas and put them back into nature. I mean, they're not going to survive one day. I mean,
Well,
there's
not just that. Look at some Chihuahuas are absolutely, totally defunct. They have very little hair and their mouths are deformed. They're just ugly as soot, because they've had too much information turned off to even be worth
Right.
having.
Right.
It comes like, for example, like you'll see BioLogos or Aaron Ra in one of his debates recently that he had live with I can't remember his name, but he said, "Oh, Adam and Eve have been disproven. It's impossible." Because Francis Collins, for example, in BioLogos, they say that there's no way that two people could generate so much genetic diversity, what we see today. But it's so funny how that reflects such a poor understanding of even basic genetics, really, because technically a man and a woman today could have thousands, even millions of children, theoretically, and no children would be 100% identical. That's because they are heterozygous. Just like when you say, like the Chihuahuas, for example, when you've gotten to that point, you've lost so much heterozygosity. So many of these alleles, so many of these genes have been turned off that you're left with something like a Chihuahua. I mean, there's been such significant information loss. So it's just funny that like your Aaron Ra wants to focus on what is information loss, but that's pretty well basic science. And Adam and Eve with built-in genetic diversity, right? Millions of these types of sites in the genome that are not homozygous, like say in a Chihuahua's genome. An unlimited amount of variability is possible. But if you look at Adam and Eve versus, let's say, humans today, there has been information loss since creation.
I think that's the law of identity too. It's actually a philosophical principle. What you're talking about is heterozygosity, so that's something to think about too.
This is exactly right. Exactly right.
Yeah, I
And that
think
would be
dogs.
optimal design too, you know, like if God are to create Adam and Eve, and then he said, be fruitful and multiply, well, built-in genetic diversity makes sense. Because now with that built-in genetic diversity, you can have as much human diversity that we see today and more built in to Adam and Eve, their very first family. So diversity is very, very easy to explain in a creation model.
So what do
Yeah, I
you?
think
Oh, go
humans
ahead,
are.
Ron.
Sorry, I think humans and actually dogs are very good examples of these things. I mean, like what we're talking about now. You know, we've bred dogs so much that you get to the poodle. What do you get after the poodle? There's such a loss of information after the poodle. Like what else are you going to get?
Exactly.
You know,
Exactly.
so it's not that it's going to gain anything after that. That's it. That's the last line of that dog. And I mean, look at humans too. I mean, we just continue to just digress. So I think us and dogs, man's best friend. That's pretty good evidence too.
It's such a good point because yeah, you can take two poodles and artificially selecting them. You're not going to get all the dog breeds we see today. What is there, 400, 450? But you can
Right.
take two general dogs, two wolves, and yeah, you could selectively breed probably in 150 years all the dog breeds we have today again.
Right. Yeah, you could take a mutt and get much more diversity than you would ever get with a poodle.
And why is that? Because there's been information loss.
Correct. Yeah.
Exactly. So even these types of basic scientific facts, evolutionists like Aaron Ra, Godless Engineer, these major scoffers, they don't get it.
So, how would you guys address that? This is what PZ Myers, freaking blabbermouth, is that through so you have a population of organisms that spawned all these human races. How would you guys address that?
Okay, so a population, you just like Adam and Eve, for example, or are we looking at? Because you
Yeah,
said
so
population of animals.
the argument is that humans could not come from individuals; it has to come from populations. And I mean that was PZ Myers, where he regurgitated when he was in the chat. I think it was in your debate, and I heard him talking crap about you, and he was talking about Adam and Eve cannot. I mean, humans cannot come from an Adam or like a mitochondrial Adam and Eve
Right.
because populations, like I guess he says, a population spawn humans and in all the diversity we have in humans.
Right. Yeah. It's pretty much it's pretty much exactly what I was talking about there because they assume just like biologos, this is their main argument. This is the argument that Aaron Ra uses based on the human genetic diversity we see today. Okay, all the different races, for example, two human beings could not generate that amount of diversity.
Right.
That's their argument. But like I said, that's just a misunderstanding of basic science because two people today could have thousands and thousands and thousands of children and not two of those children would be 100% identical. That's because of heterozygosity, recombination, for example. You're going to get variability even the next generation. So if Adam and Eve had built-in genetic diversity, then that could explain all the human diversity we see today. Like genetically praised, it technically it goes back to that idea. Like if people don't know what heterozygosity means, it's just that idea of alleles, right? Big A, big B, little b. So Adam and Eve were created genetically heterozygous, and then that would go for the kinds of animals as well. But that means if you have, say, in the genetic code, you have capital A, lowercase a, capital B, lowercase b, and then you do that for the millions of DNA positions that exist in the genome, that would mean that they have literally unlimited potential to produce all sorts of variety, even in a single generation. So once you get to the point of, say, Babel, and you get these subgroups going to different continents, different places of the earth, they're all taking different portions of that information with them. And then that's when you get the you get the different, I mean, obviously
bottlenecks and
all
all
one
that.
race, but you get the different variations in skin color and things like that. But
Right.
and they'll say, "Oh, that's ad hoc. You're just making things up." No, that leads to testable predictions. For one, if Adam and Eve were given this front-loaded genetic variety praise, then what are we going to predict? Well, we're going to predict that the vast majority of our genome is functional if God created it that way. And as you know, the evidence does suggest that the vast majority of our genetics is functional. So
is this where they make up this thing called the genetic bottleneck or whatever, and they try to get around it with that?
yeah, another good point. So human beings in general have low genetic diversity. Like, we are all 99.9% similar. So me and you, me and Neff, Neff and Ramat, for example, 99.9% similar. So that means we have low genetic diversity. We're all just too similar for the evolutionists. So if we came from millions and millions of ancestors, and then they came from, populations of ape-like creatures, I mean, there'd be a lot of mutations and DNA differences and genes floating around, a population of 1 million strong. So we should have greater genetic diversity, but we don't. So they resort to a population bottleneck about 70,000 years ago or so, where they say that the population of 1 million, I believe it's Homo erectus at that time, was reduced to just, some say 2,000, 10,000, right? So, so
What
that
a joke.
it's a joke. It's a fairy tale, because then that supposed population of 2,000 or 10,000 remained like that for many, many generations, and they inbred, and so much genetic variability was lost. And then eventually, the mitochondrial line and the Y chromosome line would have left Africa. And to them, that explains the low genetic diversity. But guess what? Just like I brought up in my debate with Erica, and pretty well in a lot of debates, because they can't answer it, even if you gave them that and said, okay, yeah, maybe there's some truth to the population bottleneck 70,000 years ago, that population bottleneck would have been so genetically compromised due to the generations after generations of inbreeding, they would not have been able to seize dominion over the earth. I mean, those recessive mutations, like Neff was talking about earlier, they would come to the forefront. And that would lead to rapid genetic degeneration. We can see that in the cheetahs today. The cheetahs are down to like 7,000. Their sperm's degenerate. Their genetics are degenerate. They will go extinct. Conservationists are scared. And I don't see these cheetahs suddenly exploding into all parts of the world, seizing dominion over the planet like they think humans did 70,000 years ago. It's a hypothetical population bottleneck fairy tale is what it is.
It's flimsy at best. And I think, didn't Ron Matt just do something on this heterozygosity with these letters? I thought he just did a video on this.
I did.
Actually, he did. Yeah, Ramat, did you want to touch on that, brother?
Yeah, because I wanted to explain it easy for people, so I just use genes and skin color. Because remember, if the out of Africa theory is true, that means that people that live in Africa are obviously black. Well, unfortunately for their theory, black-skinned people can only code for more black-skinned people. But if the first people were brown skin, they're the only people on Earth that have both the ability, because of created heterozygosity, that can code for every known skin color. So not only does it prove the creation model and the biblical account, but it invalidates the out of Africa theory at the same time. So it's a good principle to show people that way, rather than getting into like animals, like you were saying, or something that might be a little bit more confusing for people. That's a real simple way that invalidates their theory and confirms ours.
Sweet stuff, man. Your videos are just so awesome. So I think
And
you're the best videos out
I
there.
agree.
and remember, they'll often say, when we point out what a fairy tale their so-called population bottleneck of 2 or 10,000 was 70,000 years ago and how inbred they would be, they'll say, "Oh, you're giving us heck for our population bottleneck. What about your population bottleneck at creation, the flood, and Babel?" But they ask that all the time, even though Ron, Matt, and myself have answered it a million times. Our population bottlenecks were all one generation, and they were followed by exponential and rapid population growth. So the original created heterozygosity that Ramat talks about, very little to none would have been lost. But the problem with their population bottleneck is it was prolonged, and they explain all DNA differences as a result of mutation anyways. Accumulation and mutation over time is how they explain the origin of species, even though we know mutations degenerate and destroy, and yet they think mutations are the creator. So no, our population bottlenecks are not a problem, but their population bottleneck is a problem. It actually makes human evolution impossible.
Do they just invoke deep time or something? Well, eventually natural selection will save them or something. Is that what they try to invoke or something?
Well, they try and say natural selection is going to rid the population of the detrimental mutations,
Yeah.
but remember, it's so funny because when they bring up that, it's just a misunderstanding of genetic entropy, because we agree natural selection will remove the most deleterious of mutations, and it will amplify the best beneficial mutations, even though the best beneficial mutations are reductive and still result in information loss. It's the nearly neutral ones, the ones that are only slightly deleterious, that natural selection can't see. That's why they're called neutral. But we know that the genome is vastly functional, so they're better understood as nearly neutral. Those build up over time, and natural selection can't remove them. They look to some rescue devices, artificially contrived rescue devices like synergistic epistasis and mutation count mechanism, but they've been falsified. Natural selection is limited, and genetic entropy is actually a fact.
I think what's funny too is, they always talk about sheep herders. These people back then were just a bunch of sheep herders.
Yeah.
Well, these people back then, in their bottleneck, would have been, stick and stone kind of people.
Yeah, they're monkeys. Like that's like the most primitive you can get. It's even way more primitive than a goat herder. And some of
Right.
these goat herders were lawyers, freaking kings, and high positions. They were very intelligent. It's just, it just shows you how unintelligent opposition is sometimes.
Well, I guess these goat herders that wrote the Old Testament, I guess it was just a coincidence that when you plot the ages from creation, Adam, all the way to the flood and post-flood, you can actually see and calculate a linear decay curve. And for them to do that would require, if it was just a coincidence, it would be too big of a coincidence for one, but it would require incredible knowledge in mathematics. And I just don't see that as being possible. But modern genetics shows us that, okay, that makes a lot of sense based on mutation accumulation. Take that back in time to, different points of least mutation accumulation. That's a point where you've got human beings living into their hundreds. Adam living, to 900. And you can see, it's funny how they say goat herders. Look at some of the great pyramids, the things that they've built and done. They think we're smarter today. No, it's an accumulation of knowledge over time. We're standing on the shoulders of those in the past.
And you could make the argument, actually, we're not smarter. We have technology, but think 100 years ago, you didn't have a plumber come to your house and somebody to come put a roof on your house. Like, those people back then did everything. They had a lot of knowledge. They had everything to live on. Who could go out and besides Raw Matt, who could go out there and live out in the wilderness right now. You know,
Exactly.
there's a lot of knowledge that we just do not really have anymore. And again, yes, we have technology, we have smart things. You know,
Right.
it's awesome. I can get on my phone and talk to my sister, you know, from like 200 miles away. It's great, but that doesn't make me smart. You know.
No, it's exactly, it's an accumulation of knowledge over time. And yeah, sure, we got the technology now. And I love how evolutionists oftentimes they'll look at like your smartphone you're talking about or a car, and then they'll call us science deniers, right? They'll say, well, do you like your car or your phone? You know, that was the scientists that made those. It's like, no, no, no. Those were built by engineers,
Right.
not evolutionary biologists that believe pine trees and whales are related, and not by theoretical astrophysicists. They're built by engineers. Engineers are using operational and observable science to make these advances in technology. A heart surgeon doesn't need to think about his belief that a fish turned into a fisherman over millions of years through incremental changes to do his job.
But I
He's
sent
using science today to do that job.
I sent you peer review citation showing the human IQ has been degrading. So even science itself declares we're getting stupider. But here's another guy: logical, plausible, probable. Nice name.
Say that 10 times fast. John,
Hey, what's up, guys?
John
Hey,
is the man who destroyed R.J. Downard in a debate and
Oh,
has
nice.
destroyed Godless Engineer in a series of videos. So it's an honor to have you here, brother.
Oh man, thanks for having me come on, guys. That's kind of funny. You're talking about the deprecation of IQ. There's actually a very interesting additional negative factor this technology is bringing to us, which is because of the instant access to information. It's actually been shown to deactivate the hippocampus in a variety of ways, where people aren't actually storing process information, and because again, an expansion of that, they're like the younger generation is literally not building analytical brain structure. So when we having our debates and conversations and whatnot, we're wondering why people can't seem to grasp the obvious. Well, part of it is that they literally have not developed portions of brain structure that would enable them to actually comprehend and basically put two and two together and see the end conclusion, which I was reading some studies on that a couple years ago, and I thought it was extraordinarily fascinating, as well as explained some of the things that we run into.
You know what? That's a really good point, because I don't know how old all of you are, but I'm 36, and growing up, I had to remember every single one of my friends' phone numbers. My aunt's number, all that stuff. Guys, I don't even know my wife's number now. So it's just seriously, it's just you start losing, or you stop retaining things, because again, we have this smartphone. It has everything for us, so we don't even have to think about it.
Yeah, one of the studies on that, which I thought was very fascinating, was on you guys ever notice how people can't seem to know where the heck they're going or where they came from? They did a big study back in London. They hooked up like 5,000 cab drivers to brain scanners while they were like out driving around, and half of them used GPS, the other half didn't. And it turned out that when you're using GPS, your hippocampus is literally not storing your route information, so it's not even there to access. And to me, that explains a lot of what we deal with on a daily basis. People can't tell you to get their own house, and it's, well, you weren't actually using that portion of your brain.
Yeah.
Incredible. And yeah, have you heard, like, there's people like Bill Gates and these people that form these electronic companies, they don't even raise their kids with technology. So that should tell you something.
Yeah, that's a good point. My daughter, we had her on learning programs early, and she was on the like a phone or something like that, and she didn't retain things. But once we took that away, she started, and she got really smart, like really fast. Once I started taking that stuff away from her, she just started picking up on things. She started speaking more clear, and it was great.
Just goes to show you convenience isn't always a convenience.
Right, and in most cases today, it's more like a babysitter, you know, and every parent, I believe, is probably guilty of that. But you know, once you start seeing your child not developing, you kind of have to be like, hey, wait a minute, let's take this back.
Right. What's scary now is that because of this quarantine, basically worldwide, people are going to be basically confined to their house with nothing but entertainment. The word muse means to think, and amusement means to not think. And everything people do is amusement. It's things to do to not think. I find that fairly ironic that people are just surrounded by things that's amusement. They do not try to learn anything.
So
That's
you,
very true.
so do you guys think that the dumbing down of the masses, this has something to do with popular theory of evolution, why people believe in it? Do you see the correlation there?
Well, Praise, it's interesting. It's very interesting you bring that up. The last video I did was on the effect of Darwinism on critical thinking. And the supposition I made was that because the entire premise of Darwinism requires the suspension of like analytical thought and recognition of evidence, and you have to consciously force yourself to not reach the logical conclusion, that because the overall Darwinian worldview has permeated pretty much every aspect of society now, outside, not just in biology, but as we all know, in so many other fields, that my conclusion was, and I'm not saying this is 100% across the board in every facet, but the long tail negative outcome has to be, if you're suspending, when it comes to existence, if you're suspending rational thought, that same premise has to extenuate to your other issues that you're contemplating. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I know your video didn't go very good on Facebook, I heard.
Funny, everybody was telling me that I was being incoherent and they couldn't comprehend the premise I was putting forth, which I thought was rather ironic since they were exemplifying the entire point I was making.
Exactly. And it was a short video, like what, 9 minutes?
Yeah.
So, yeah, not even like something hard for attention span. But my friend does YouTube for a living, basically, and he said that the average attention span is about 2 minutes and 50 seconds on YouTube. So maybe you got to trim it down a little.
Yeah.
It's interesting. Yeah, it's like I used to work heavily in the tech space, and I used to follow all the studies on like average online retentions and stuff for like just like normal websites and whatnot. And over the years, it like dropped and dropped and dropped. And I got to the realization that if you go and check Google's how-to videos, whatever that time is what the next study will say is the attention span. And a couple of they got more access to more data than anybody else. And it was interesting, like how-to videos and stuff now on Google, I think are like 47 seconds or something like that. And I remember when I first started tracking it, it was almost 2 minutes. And it's like, huh. And then lo and behold, the next study would come out and it would be like, hey, the average retention span on a website for, XYZ is a minute and 13 seconds, a minute and 47. It was pretty interesting to watch that digression.
That's pretty crazy. I know that most people leave YouTube when there's a commercial.
I think that's a prime example as to why a lot of the objections that these evolutionists and atheists will throw at us, they've been answered by us so many times in videos that unfortunately for them is maybe 9 or 10 minutes long, and they can't seem to get through the entire video. So they're either going to straw man our position, or they're just going to use the same objections over and over again.
Yeah, it really is interesting to me. I'm sure you guys have noticed this, but the ongoing argument of modern synthesis being completely accepted and whatnot, they don't seem to realize that the evolutionary biologists are all arguing over modern synthesis, whether or not and neo-Darwinism in general, whether or not it's viable.
Right.
And the fact that they don't know this but they're making these, extraordinarily adamant arguments that it's, accepted. And it seems like, back to the whole point we're making on the denial aspect of, it doesn't matter how many times you put it in their face. Even the experts don't agree on this,
Right.
but they refuse to even consider that premise. And I don't know if you guys have run into that, but I've been seeing a lot of that going on lately.
Oh yeah, big time. And they don't even understand exactly. They don't understand the problems. They don't understand the debate that's going on amongst biologists and geneticists on, especially the mechanisms for neo-Darwinism. And you said it perfectly. And they're so adamant about their position. James Downard, who you debated, I mean, he's more adamant about his arguments and objections, more adamant than almost anybody that I've ever met. That's an evolutionist.
His adamancy was embodied when I got him to admit that he felt that Facebook, Google, Twitter, and Snapchat, if given enough time, could build themselves. I couldn't believe he actually. I couldn't when he responded, yes, they could. I about burst out laughing. It was all I could do to keep it straight.
Well, that's all you can do at something like that is pretty well laugh. That's amazing. He'll often ask direct questions, and he'll do it in like a source methods way of debating, but then you'll ask him direct questions that he has a difficult time answering, and then a question like that you asked him, I guess he pretty much had to answer it that way, or else it would have been a soft admission that the proposed Darwinian mechanisms of mutation, natural selection are not going to build such a multi-layered, sophisticated information system that we have genetically.
You're a dumb creator, though, standing for the truth, because 98% of biologists believe in evolution. But you know where this poll comes from? It comes from the National Academy of Sciences. I mean, they're all anti-Christians there. I mean, it's basically just like the other anti-Christian associations. I forget the other one out there. It's like a political one. I don't know, but I mean, come on, it's an atheist cult there. Of course they're all going to believe in evolution of the National Academy of Sciences. Come on. You got to get a bigger poll than that.
Yeah, and that's what they'll call us, creatars or science deniers. But John, in your video where you talked about, how our information system is evidence of a designer based on the prescriptive nature of it, and Godless Engineer, he came out and he's infamous for that claim that he's saying that the biological information, we were talking about this earlier, it's nothing more than just organic chemistry, right? It's not real information. But you had a funny clip in there of, I'm guessing it was I'm not sure if it was an evolutionist or who it was, but he was saying that nobody who knows science and knows the field would ever make that claim. Can you elaborate on that a bit?
Yeah, so that first funny video where he talks about only people that argue that it's not information in code are people that are ignorant. That was Perry Marshall of the Evolution 2.0 deal.
Right.
And then the second video I had in there was, and if you guys haven't watched this, I would strongly recommend checking it out. So I think it was last May, the Royal Society, which we all know is one of the premier institutions on this planet, right? They officially became part of, and actually members of their organization became judges in the $10 million contest for anybody who can create a naturally occurring, without direction, coding, information transfer, and decoding process. And Dennis Noble, a very well credentialed scientist, he actually talks about it in quite a few different lectures about basically the collapse of neo-Darwinism. But for anybody that argues that DNA is not code, quite literally, the Royal Society has officially said that yes, it is, and yes, it's I think his words were it's. Not exact verbatim, but pretty close. One of the most ignored and most important factors of science. And to me, when you look at that, it's kind of if you're going to continue to argue that it's not information, then you are just clearly ignorant of reality.
It's like arguing that a computer contains no real information. It's nothing more than mere electricity flowing through circuits. You know, information is information, and we talked about it earlier. I mean, regardless of the medium, and yeah, you've got the godless engineers of the world that are just out to continue stating that it's nothing more than mere organic chemistry, contrary to what the professionals are actually saying and admitting. It's amazing, actually.
A quick thing that I'd known, but I hadn't been able to find like a definitive source on until relatively recently, is that, and to me, this completely embodies the entire premise of code, right? Did y'all know that chemically, the amino acids in the tRNAs never have any chemical contact or reaction with the codons? And they actually saw there was I watched an Open MIT biological chemistry lecture, and they were discussing that whole premise. And to me, that completely destroys this is nothing but chemical reactions if there is no chemical reaction. And Nefri was talking about this earlier about the syntax and and also the computation ability of the ribosome. It's like, so the ribosome can identify whether or not it's the correct amino acid that correlates with the codon, but they never contact each other. So there has to be a medium of information transfer.
Right. Yeah, that's amazing. We all contain information, these information systems that we've been talking about for a while, and everything you just said, these things greatly exceed our comprehension. I love asking the evolutionists, where does all this specified information come from? It's not hard for us to explain based on our position, but for them, it's pretty well impossible.
Stuff just happened though, like the pond scum, pond puddle or whatever. So, and I think a lot of people know who James Tour is, and he completely just makes it clear that's almost like magic. If you're gonna say chemically something could bring life, that's required for biological life. It's magic. So.
Yeah, he did a debate recently, actually. I think it was on Unbelievable.
Talking about this one with Lee Cronin?
Right. Yeah. From what I gathered, yeah, he, the evolutionist, the one defending abiogenesis, didn't do too well against James Tour.
I actually watched that last week, and he actually got Cronin to admit that what he was trying to pull off was literally had nothing to do with whether or not life could actually come from his experiments, which I thought was priceless.
Right. Well, that's just like that's a definition of defeat then.
And what was very interesting about it, I don't know if you guys have watched any other Lee Cronin's interviews and debates and whatnot, but his one with Jim Tour was like a complete paradigm shift, because he knew he was going up against someone not only his equal, potentially, professionally superior in credentials to him, and he couldn't pull his, I'm a smart guy, I do all this stuff kind of thing, BS on Jim Tour, because he knew he'd get called out.
I couldn't imagine having to put myself in, the position of an evolutionist and try and defend something like, for one, abiogenesis, which is 100% impossible, but even evolution, as far as neo-Darwinism goes, it really, I even trying, pretending to argue for that and how all this specified information arose. it's an impossible position to defend.
Well, just in the fact of it, they always say magic. Oh, magically this stuff happened. For a creationist. Well, how did intelligence become? From matter. Oh, magic. What
Right.
what is their actual you know thing for it? I mean, they don't have a response for it. The universe starting. There was nothing, but then magically everything came into existence. There's so many things that's magic in in that sense, but they plagiarize it to us like it's something out of this. It's out of the realm.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, they're magical processes of natural selection acting upon random variation and random mutation in some type of unguided process is going to explain all known, new innovations, body plans, the novel information that must be explained. And what we now know about these mechanisms is these type of novelties cannot be the result of these mechanisms of natural selection and random variation and random mutation. So yeah, they're going to accuse us of magic, not even realizing that what they believe is magic. It's non-science. It's nonsense.
Right.
Epitome of magic, but if you look at the word magic, it means illusion anyway. I don't see how that applies to any type of god or creator. So I don't even know if they're even applying the word magic correctly. If you do
I
some
agree.
research on it,
Right.
I totally agree with that because when you talk about God creating everything, like the most supreme being ever, how is that magic? That's not magic. That's creation. And
right?
I don't see them saying, oh, well, obviously they scoff, and that's one of the biggest things they use, to elude. And to me, it just seems like, okay, well, you could go in 12 different directions from there, but, you know, to say magic, it's like, okay, no one was in there with their mortar and pestle, creating potions, doing this stuff, in the Bible it says God created the world just with his words. That's amazing. That's not magic. I mean, who can just sit here and say something and create?
Yeah, will. Well, I mean, people will things into existence all the time. It's just on a more grand level. Like we can, like you have so many patents out there that people do, and then see they will that into existence, whatever they made, and it's just on the grand level with God. So whenever someone says it's magic, it's just really will.
Yeah, and that would be God's will.
Yep. What's interesting for me about that in context from a scientific perspective, and I really got it just about a decade ago. I read this book called The Quantum Enigma, and Inspiring Philosophy talks about it in some of his videos, but I'd read it 10 years ago, and it really started me down the path of where I am now and they were discussing the whole wave function collapse, superposition, all those kind of different components. But what they were really breaking it down to is that things don't exist in two places. They're only in the one that gets chosen. And anyway, basically they boiled this all down to, and what I ultimately recognized was, in Genesis and what you were just talking about and God said, and it was so. Well, it's, and God thought, and it was so. And to me, that really put existence into perspective from a scientific, angle of, when we're talking about quantum mechanics. The will of God is literally what caused the universe to come into existence. And from a quantum mechanics perspective, that is not magic. That is a completely explainable premise. And last year, I saw these interviews with Paul Davies and a bunch of the other top theoretical physicists, and they were asked directly about this problem. And they all stated, well, it appears that consciousness is required. However, we all know there was no consciousness at the beginning of the universe. Therefore, there must be something else we haven't accounted for. And it's like, okay, so if God did exist, if the consciousness of God, or the supreme being consciousness existed, removing religion from the equation, then it would 100% explain everything from a scientific perspective of how we exist. And in context of all things we've been talking about tonight of, the grand delusion, we've had 200 years of trying to figure out the double slit experiment, and every single different variation they've come up with has forced the empirical conclusion that conscious measurement is required. It's like, so the atheists always argue for the empirical evidence, and I'm like, it's right there. There's 200 years of experiments that prove this to be true, and you guys are denying it under the premise that there is no higher power required for the universe, let alone for life to exist. And I don't know, for me, that's one of those things of, it's such a dichotomy. It's such a split view of worldview.
It is. Yeah, it's amazing because they admit it, but then they say, well, that can't be so because of their basic premise or their basic assumption and worldview. When we can sit back and look at it and just worship the God, the designer who made it all possible based on just he thought it into existence. That's a great way to put it.
But no, that objection isn't true, though, because it's called the measurement problem. It just becomes an infinite regress. So if there's something that needs to form the wave function, so they can't say even before the universe there is no mind, because for even the universe to be there, it needs to be an observer for even the universe to exist. So I think that's demonstrably false anyway, even through quantum mechanics. So whoever said that is misrepresenting quantum mechanics.
Well, now you're just talking semantics, okay?
Yeah, and then it just goes in circles. Yeah, how would they get out of that problem?
Well, that's the whole point I'm making, is there is no way to escape it other than to claim that there's some other undiscovered law that is causing this, that completely overrides all of the evidence that says the opposite. And there is no escape for that one. In my opinion, there is no escape for that. At this point, 200 years of experimentation that all says that. I mean, I'll send you all this link. There was an article written last year by these guys. I think they've published, I think it was like 7 or 8 different papers on this exact topic, right? And this article they wrote in one of the journals, they quite literally said, guys, at this point, we can no longer deny we know this is metaphysical, we know this is philosophical, but we can no longer ignore the reality that consciousness is required. And no, we do not want to hear about your whole, the measuring device is physical and not conscious, all that stuff. Like, that has been disproven.
Yeah.
We have to accept.
That's with the von Neumann chain. Let's see what happens is, well, what collapses that? What collapses that? What collapses that? This becomes an infinite regress. So there has to be something outside the material world, or this realm, or if you want to call it this dimension, or that has to collapse the wave function. So if anything, we're more fundamental. Our will, our choices are more fundamental than even reality itself. I mean, that shows you right there, it's spiritual reality.
Well, I think that goes into, that Einstein quote, if you can't explain it to a 6-year-old, you don't understand it yourself. And I think in a lot of ways, evolutionists, they get a childlike knowledge of the Bible. You know what I mean? So they don't really understand it because they don't read it. They don't understand it. They just get this childlike thing, like,
ignorance.
God is just this, he's a white bearded guy in a cloud, and it's like, wait a minute, hold on. Like he's outside of it. He can see everything. And, until they can get past that, all they see is this childlike look at things, and they're like, "Oh yeah, well, yeah, I've never seen anybody in the sky, so you know," and then that's it.
And then Noah's flood somehow gets some butthurt. I have no idea why skeptics talk about Noah's flood so much. I really don't.
Well, it's the God of the Bible that they hate, and like he said, they have a childlike understanding. A straw man understanding is what it is. I mean, you put it perfectly. I mean, God, the God of the Bible, the God of this universe, is outside the universe. He's outside time, matter, and space, and he can go in it, through it, and just like you were saying with consciousness. I mean, it has to be. This universe had to have been brought forth from outside of itself, and there's no way around it. And I always wonder, how do they even get past? And it almost seems redundant, but I ask the evolutionists or the atheists in debates all the time. I mean, if you look at the first and second laws of thermodynamics, the first law, matter and energy can neither be created nor destroyed. But then you got the second law that says everything's winding down, the law of increasing entropy. I mean, take that back to a point of least increasing entropy. And the fact that matter and energy can neither be created nor destroyed, that would have to be a moment of creation. It can't be eternal. So, where did that initial matter and energy come from? Is the energy eternal? I've never had a good answer. I mean, they accuse us creationists of using those arguments all the time, and it's redundant, but I've never heard. I mean, how do they explain that? How do they get around it?
Well, that's how, it's, again, it's that childlike mentality that they just don't understand. They could bring up any, how many times have you had a conversation with somebody and they bring up, um, God wanting to murder children and everything
Right,
like that.
the
It's
babies inside Noah's flood. Your God
yeah,
killed all the babies.
yeah, and it's like, hold on a second, did you read what was going on? You know, I don't. They just never have that information to understand. Okay, this was crazy. Things were really bad. Like God
Right.
literally said that He could read the minds of every man, and it was just evil.
Pure evil.
Every thought was evil, and it's like, if every thought was evil, that's horrible. I mean, that is a horrible generation. That's like saying that, you know, in this day and age, is saying like you were okay, you would hate God because Adolf Hitler, uh, and his regime didn't succeed. It's like, wait a minute, you know, these are some bad things that happened, and you can't just sit here and think, oh, these people were just innocent. We're all guilty, every single one of us.
Of death.
The very first sin, that means you've committed them all. So it doesn't matter after that point. It's, that's your judgment. And when God brought Jesus to us, that's our salvation. And they just don't understand. Again, it's that childlike mentality, because they don't even understand Jesus. They always want to go back to the Old Testament, but they don't understand Jesus. They don't understand the Gospels
Right.
to be able to go back, and just realize it's, God is love. Everything's been done out of love. And if they went back and then read, the Old Testament, then they would see that love, that He was patient. He did all these things. He's just, though, as well. A judge is not a horrible person for, sentencing somebody that murdered somebody. Every time they use those arguments about that, just put a judge's name instead of God there, and they just sound ridiculous.
Yeah, right. So I would say God legally has the right to punish man to death. I mean, that's clear because the repercussions of missing the mark on His law is death. So Romans 6:23. So yeah, God has the legal right to do that. Atheists and unbelievers just don't understand that. Maybe they should learn not to be so self-righteous.
Well, that's what it is. It's self-righteousness. They don't want to believe. That's why, like we were talking about probably an hour ago or so, that you could be debating them about the evidence and the scientific data, all day long, and then you ask them the simple question that if you were actually given the evidence that would suffice for you, would you now become a believer? And then they'll admit no, because God is a big meanie, or God did this or that, because it does ultimately come down to their sin, and even when it comes to salvation, just like you said, I mean, Jesus he's the second Adam. And Jesus said that, whosoever shall not receive the kingdom of God as a little child shall in no wise enter therein. And that's what salvation's all about. I mean, they have to humble themselves. They have to put their faith and trust in the finished work of Jesus Christ. And a lot of these atheists, unfortunately, pride and what they believe is intellectual superiority hinders them from that. They literally need to come to God as a little child, and they can't do that, unfortunately. I think it comes down to their sin at the end of the day.
Right. And I don't know if you guys did this, but when I was a kid and I read the book of Job, that like really opened my eyes. Like there's like what 3 chapters where God is scorning him.
Right.
About, do you know who did this and did that? They're like, where were you at? It's like, hold on. And then Job's kind of like backpedaling, wait, okay, okay, I don't know these things, so I will trust you. And that, that's the whole point of
Right.
the whole book. I mean, it's a long book, but in the end, it's really about, it's not about what happens to us in this life, but it's about trusting in God, and no matter what happens, we have to put our trust in him. So when people bring up these other things and, like, oh, I can't believe he did this and did that and did that, read Job, because then you'll look and say, okay, well, yeah, how can I sit here and call God immoral? Who would know better? The one that created everything, the stars, knows every single hair on my head. It's numbered on every single person on the planet from every single point in this, in our time scale. That's crazy. That's a lot of detail. Every single bacteria, everything created. God did that. So how could you tell God anything? What knowledge do you have to tell him anything?
And I think what you're saying coincides with different things we run into in the debates and whatnot. Of from our perspective, we are recognizing that multiple things. One, everything you just said, and then secondarily that this is but a mere the time we spend in the mortal coil is a mere blip in our total existence, right?
Exactly.
And I've actually contemplated this quite a bit, of trying to figure out like how do they come to these conclusions and stuff. And to me, one of the single biggest factors that leads to the subjectivity of their views and all those different components is if you were viewing your existence as only this time on this planet, then and there's no other opportunities to escape and have something more, right? Then your perspective of the things in the Old Testament and God doing all these things and cutting people's lives short and wiping people off the planet.
Right.
If there was nothing for them to experience and to exist and go on to do, then those things do seem completely untenable and unreasonable, right? And the evil, angry God, right? But if from the other perspective, it's, hey, you realize this is like the infancy of your like eternal existence, right? There's
Right.
there's way more to existence than this, and to me, that creates a entirely different paradigm of worldview. And secondary to all that, it also dramatically exacerbates negatives that they're experiencing now. like that whole
Right.
argument about like, why does God let children get cancer and why does all these bad things happen, yada yada. It's like, well, they're only they're bad from your current perspective.
Hmm.
They're not necessarily bad from the eternal perspective.
Right.
And until you make that connection, I think that's one of the bridges that has to be crossed in the mind of the unbeliever. And until they have that realization, a lot of things that we discuss make absolutely no sense and seem like this completely superfluous, stupid crap that we're talking about versus actual, really logical, plausible, and probable conclusions.
Right.
I think that's why it's not bothersome or troublesome to us, because we look to eternity. Them, you put it perfectly. If this mere existence, is all that they believe is there, well, for one, they're putting their limited selves and trying to understand an infinite God, right? And for one, they're trying to judge his actions in the limited state that they're in. But from our perspective, that's right. The things that have gone on in the Bible, you'll get atheist apologists like Skylar Fiction that are always asking, why did God do this? Why did God do that? And usually has the exact same scenarios all the time, but it's exactly a worldview issue. Because to us, even death, to us who are saved, there is no death. All God is doing is taking us from one place and bringing us to another place. Taking us from earth and bringing us into eternity. So those things that take place in the Old Testament, the evolutionists accuse God of being a bad God, or as Richard Dawkins says, committing genocide and all this stuff. They can't see the bigger picture. To them, there is no bigger picture.
Right. Yeah. And the thing with Dawkins when he talks about genocide, again, it's, if you're thinking about a judge, the judge is sending out a warrant for these people, and he used the Israelites to condition that warrant, so it's not genocide in the sense of, oh, I'm just going to kill all these people for no reason. He's not Saddam. He didn't just sit there and, kill all the Kuwaitis. That's not what he did. God can see into our soul. He can, he knows our thoughts. If if God judges you on something and knows you're not going to change, that's his judgment. Again, we're all judged by God.
Well, and the thing is too, like, for example, I debated Skylar Fiction. He was like one of my first debates a year and a half ago or something. And like Prey said, they love to bring up, Noah's flood, for example, or the
The
Canaanites and
Amalekites.
of course, the conquests in Joshua and stuff. And I point out to him that, and the thing is, the atheists can't see the bigger picture. So to them, this is just blasphemy or whatever. But even if you look at, antibiotics, for example, what happens if you're prescribed antibiotics and you don't finish your course? Because a lot of people, they'll start feeling better and then they'll say, okay, I don't need to finish the last couple days of my antibiotic treatment. But the thing is, if you don't finish your course, well, what's going to happen is the bad bacteria that may be left over, they're going to grow and develop resistance based on you stopping the antibiotics too soon. So when it comes to, the big bad God of the Old Testament, apparently killing everybody, say in the flood, that this was necessary. Just like when we take a round of antibiotics, unfortunately, we're killing the bad bacteria and you're killing the good bacteria, but it's actually necessary. And they can't understand that analogy and that take on it. But God has the right to judge his creation, and like was pointed out earlier, every heart, every mind was pure evil, and God had to wipe the earth clean, and he had to start anew.
Right. I think another thing you're trying to make the point is that there's a perspective that God is his ways are higher. He sees things that we do not.
That's
So
right.
when it comes to a person dying here, that doesn't mean anything to an eternal, mortal God.
Right.
So with the plan of salvation, when it comes to that, yes, there could have been people that died in the Old Testament that were caught in the judgment of God, but still, that doesn't negate them from still His higher plan for that soul, still, because they can still gain salvation. And even Jesus says I mean, I don't know if people believe this or not, but I don't. I mean, there's different perspectives on this as well. But during the 3 days when he was in the tomb, he was preaching to the lost souls all the way back to Noah's time, the ones that were destroyed in the Noah's flood. So, in my opinion, he did uh, rescue those out of those in hell, or what do you call it, Hades or Sheol. So even those souls could be in heaven right now, enjoying God and eternal bliss, or whatever you want to call it, in paradise. So atheists just don't think of those circumstances.
Well, just like the doctor who prescribes you the 7-day treatment of antibiotics sees the bigger picture. He says, take your
Right.
full course because you need to get all the bad bacteria. And unfortunately, there's going to be some good bacteria in there. But this is a necessary evil, or else these bacteria are going to become immune. They're going to become resistant. And in the long run, in the bigger picture, that's not a good thing. And just like what occurred in the Old Testament in the flood, I mean, for the most part, the humans that were living during that time, it sounds like they would have, analogous to the bacteria, they were probably all bad bacteria for the most part. But yeah, it does come down to the bigger picture that we can see. And the fact that we can look to eternity, and in the atheists, they just look to the now and here.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, go ahead.
We've been talking about the word eternity and the big picture, everything. One of the things that I find very frustrating with, and I think this affects the worldview dichotomies as well, is so much of, especially modern religion, we frame so often eternity is framed as this extraordinarily esoteric and borderline boring, right? We hear that from the atheists all the time. Like, I don't want to be sitting there strumming a harp in the clouds for ever and ever, right? How boring is that? But in my opinion, when you actually look at what's talked about in Revelation, the new heaven and new earth, and the new nations, all these different things, to me that does not sound boring. Number one, but number two, when you contemplate the premise that we may no longer be bound by the restrictions this current body we has, right? And I've contemplated the whole premise of why is the universe so big, right? Well, if we're not going to be bound by space and time anymore, right? Then that means with a thought we could be anywhere. And to me, the premise of being able to think and then be going and chilling on Mars, or go watching a supernova, or whatever's going on wherever I am, to me, I find that extraordinarily fascinating. And I think that you're talking about an infinity to learn of both the power of God as well as to explore his creation. And I think that's very interesting and a completely different perspective than what people think about so often, especially those aren't believers. That it's just going to be this boring experience.
Right. And I think, when Jesus said, if you can't understand these earthly things, how can I explain heavenly things?
Right.
So we don't even know everything that's going to go on, like who knows what's really going to happen, I can't remember who said it, but maybe you could smell sound. It's like, I was like, what?
Yeah, I think that was
sound?
Owen.
Yeah, and I was like, wait a minute, smell sound? It's like, but hey, maybe that would be awesome,
What if there's science in heaven? They have a bunch of creatures there where people can study. Like, people like doing that, so who knows? That's probably there too.
Well, that's what atheists say. They say, "Oh, eternity, that sounds boring," type thing. But we are bound, like John said, we are bound by our flesh. I mean, when at the moment of salvation, our flesh didn't change. We still have this unregenerate flesh. What changed was our spirits. Our spirits were regenerated. When we die, our unregenerate flesh dies, and our regenerated spirit is what goes to heaven. Therefore, we're no longer going to have these fleshly thoughts. We're no longer going to have the unregenerate, fallen, sinful flesh that we now have currently. So yeah, in heaven, like John said, I mean, you could just think yourself somewhere, or it's kind of like trying to explain colors to a blind person. How do you explain red or blue to somebody who unfortunately was born blind? I mean, it's nearly impossible, and that's why Jesus says, if you can hardly understand earthly things, how can I begin to explain to you heavenly things?
Exactly.
I listened to a funny interview one time. I mean, it was real quick. This guy came up with a microphone and he asked this older guy, he said, okay, I've got 2 questions for you. A, you get to spend eternity in heaven with your wife. And he goes, B. He didn't care what the answer was. He was like, I'm not interested.
That's good.
That was pretty funny, but we know that God isn't confined to time, because he took his prophets both forward and backwards in time. It means nothing to him because he's the Lord of time. And what's interesting is in Revelations it says that the sun even melts away, and that God will light the world in the next life. So there might not even be days. There could be no more time at all. We can't fathom that because we've only lived in the existence of time. We think linearly. So it's really hard for us to fathom what eternity might even be like when it's not. We can't even fathom that because we only think about tomorrow, the next day. It's like, wow, that's a long time. But if there is no time, it means nothing.
Well, at the end of the day, God, he's been to all of our funerals. He's in eternity. Yeah, that's why when Christians get worried over certain things, I mean, just read Revelation, read the last sentence. There's nothing to fear. We win. We know the end of the story.
I think a good point too is that also we've all had these thoughts, right? I mean, we've all had these negative thoughts, or I don't know if I believe this or believe that, and I think that's one of the hardest things for an atheist to come around to, is that they believe that we just blindly believe this stuff. That's not what it is. Like we've had these thoughts too. We've had these thoughts of doubt. We've had thoughts of just like, is this true or not? But again, we have to find things in the Bible, and they bring us back to it. And that's why the Bible is a hyperlink. You can take one text and it's also in like 12 other different places.
Well, what they do is the critics that I find, they if they attack the Bible, what they do is they usually just Google something and then they take one doctrine and they build an upside down theology based on one scripture.
Right.
And they don't really read the entire context. They don't step back and look at it as a whole. So they have a lot of arguments, but they're so easily answered if they wanted to answer it. But the thing is they hate it like they hate creation, right? They're not willing to look at the other model. They even joke and go, creation doesn't have a model. They even go that far. They don't. That's how little they understand it.
Right.
I find that pretty crazy.
It's in the Bible, of course. I mean, it does say that faith is the substance of things hoped for, and the evidence of things not seen. But the difference between us and the atheists is that faith that we have in the Word of God, the faith that we put in Jesus Christ. That's not a blind faith. It is a faith that is based on evidence. And like we said earlier, I mean, God didn't have to give us all this scientific evidence, but we can actually look at the beginning chapters of the Bible. We can look at Genesis. We can look at the history that it records for us. I mean, the Bible literally says it's the history of the universe, and we can use that, and we can make predictions. We can make retrodictions, and that's why we have such a strong biblical based model to go along with with our faith. And we touched on it earlier. I mean, everything in genetics, everything in biology and geology points to a genesis that we can take literal, and we can be, we can know that our faith is also backed up by evidence. It's not a blind faith like the atheist has.
Right, and they just don't know that. I think that's the sad thing about it is, I mean, all of you compared to me, I'm a layman to some of the things you guys talk about, and I understand it to the best of my ability, I guess. But you know, I've spent a lot of my time just in the Bible. I've also researched on the other side though too. And they don't do that. They don't go into our side. They don't look at it at all. It's really sad.
Yeah, it is. Well, like you said, you mentioned earlier, me and you were talking, and they've already made up their mind. They're like, well, if God was true, would you worship? They just say no, right? They have a conflict going on inside their own mind. They're like, well, if God is real, then he wouldn't be this way. So they've already made up their determination or their mindset. And
Exactly.
what I've noticed is that they've done this already. For example, with the flood, right? Well, they don't even consider the flood had a huge warning. How long did it take them to build the boat? People go, well, God killed those children. No, their parents killed their children. They were
Right.
told to get on the boat. You had 100 years to get on the thing. They chose not to. It wasn't God's fault. It was their parents' fault.
Well, I mean, there's key background knowledge on there too. I don't know if people really looked into this, but I think it's in the book of Peter or Jude where it says Noah was a preacher of righteousness. So Noah was warning these people, like he was preaching to them, just like the street preachers, repent and come back to the Lord.
That's right. That's a phenomenal verse, praise, and that's a really good point, Matt. That it's their parents' fault. A lot of Christians forget that. Yeah, Noah was given the opportunity to preach. He was a preacher of righteousness for 100 years. And who came onto the ark? Just Noah and his family. And it's just like today, just like the Bible says that it's going to be just like the days of Noah.
Yeah,
And
how many people are saying repent? Like, I don't know how many. Just turn on YouTube. The street preachers are everywhere. So, judgment's coming down. So,
And there would be crazy movies like the Noah movie. Remember, they had Methuselah die from the flood in that movie. Methuselah himself got wiped out and killed. Remember?
Yeah.
yeah.
And what happened in that movie? The Tubal Cain, raised an army of men, and they tried to take over the ark instead of just listening to Noah. But yeah, I mean, it's the exact same thing today. I think there's even a passage in the Bible that says, when Jesus returns, will he find faith on the earth? Because is it going to be just like the days of Noah, where there's only a select few? I mean, the Bible does say, narrow is the way, and few there be that find it.
I think something interesting as well, is the Nephilim, from back then too. And, the fallen it showed in that movie, I thought that was actually an intriguing way to present the fallen. I don't know if you guys agree with me there, but, how they were all just material, I thought that was really, really intriguing.
You got to see Matt's video on the film. It's pretty good.
Yeah, Matt does have a really good video on the Nephilim. We just got a comment in the chat that people are enjoying it, and I think that's what was good about tonight. We touched on so many topics. I mean, we started with the coronavirus, viruses in general. We got into many lines of evidence.
Heterozygosity.
Heterozygosity. You know what, James Downer? I think he wakes up in the middle of the night sometimes screaming heterozygosity.
I think a lot of atheists do.
He absolutely hates that word. I'm gonna send him a T-shirt that says SFT on one side and the other side heterozygosity.
I like that word, man.
Oh, it's a great word. Yeah, it's It is a great word. I guess it's getting kind of late here. Maybe if we wanted to kind of end the discussion with everybody, and also, we'd like to thank everybody for joining us. It's been a great discussion. I mean, we can kind of go around the panel, if you want to call it that, and have some final words and thoughts if you guys wanted to.
You start us off, SFT.
Yeah, I would just say to the audience, thanks for joining us. I know a lot of us are on shutdown and on quarantine. So it was one point I wanted to make earlier. Yeah, it was Matt who said that unfortunately, because of this quarantine, a lot of people are going to be stuck at home and stuck on their electronic devices and watching movies and doing whatever, not using their brain and thinking. But that's what we're trying to change here with starting with tonight. I mean, we had a few hours here where we used our minds, discussed the evidence. So we're hoping to have a lot of that this week. I think there's going to be a couple debates. We're just waiting to confirm it. Next Friday, we should have Jordan. He's a nuclear engineer. Rob, Matt, and myself debated him. He'll be debating Bill Morgan on creation versus evolution. And I'm in talks to debate, I think, Mark Drysdale or Drysdale, however you say it, probably next Saturday. So plus some streams in between. So we should have a lot of fun for the next couple of weeks while people are stuck indoors. So I'll just thanks for everyone coming today. Great discussion. And hopefully we'll have a lot more of it in the coming weeks.
Awesome, man. Conflict, go ahead, man.
I guess my final points would just be that if you are an atheist watching this, I know I watch a lot of atheist videos, but my message to you would be that please look into the Bible. If you are not actually 100% sold on evolution, or you don't even know that God does not exist or not, please, look into it. Start reading the Bible. You can come to us, and any one of us would be willing to help you out and guide you on your path. And that's all I've got to say. God bless.
God bless.
Awesome. All right, Logical, you're up.
Well, I want to say thanks to everybody for letting me come on. I really appreciate all the things that you guys have done. Some standing, you specifically were actually kind of an inspiration for me to start my own channel and start getting into this more, and kind of try to take some different approaches than what you're doing, because you got a lot of so many of the angles already covered. What I would leave with folks is, we talked about doubt earlier, and as we talked, as Conflict was saying, we've all had those moments of doubt where we question it, especially when you're facing off against this extraordinary aggression from the opposite side. And one of the things that I now do just out of awe to our Creator, but I used to do when I was questioning things, especially regarding evolution, was I'd go and search on YouTube for DNA transcription animation. And if you go and actually find some of these amazing 3D animations of what is actually happening for the expression of a gene and the copying of our DNA and all those different components, your mind will be blown. And the premise that this could have happened by chance and without design, if your mind is open, will be completely, you'll be blown away and just be like, wow, yeah, that didn't happen by accident. So I would go check that out and just contemplate whether or not it is logical, plausible, or probable that nanomachines could come into existence without a designer.
I love it, brother. And I got to say, you're a genius on this topic. So I'm looking forward to seeing you in more debates and discussions with these evolutionists, because from what I've seen, you're a powerhouse for the faith, man. So God bless.
Appreciate it.
Nice. Praise, you want to say something, man?
I'm going to probably work on a book about slavery and the biblical slavery. And there's just so many misconceptions and misnomers and misinterpretations, and from the skeptical left, or just skeptics or atheists, whatever you want to call them. So I'm going to work on that. Um, yeah, I second everything that's been said tonight with intelligent design. I think it's irrefutable. We have a medium that is immaterial. We have a medium that's immaterial in our own cells, and it's prescriptive information. I think that should be, I mean, that's just inexcusable to just brush that aside and say that's natural. It's patently impossible. So I would just say, if a skeptic's looking for direct evidence for God, well, there it is. It's intelligent design through the information. But I appreciate being on the show and the opportunity, SFT. So go ahead, you can go next here, Matt, if you want.
Sure. Yeah. Well, if there's any critics listening or any atheist, I'm going to put you in God's shoes for just a minute. And anybody can play this game. I want you to pretend that you're God. Now, I want you to create a robot. It's the first one you've ever made, and you love this robot. You've never made anything like it before, and you've designed it, and you've given it a consciousness, and you've created it, and you told it exactly what it needs to consume. You tell it, drink oil. That's it. That's the best thing that you can possibly consume. And then you also tell it, make sure to never kill anything else. And you're going to start making more robots now. And you do this. You start inventing robot after robot after robot. But that first one, it decides to start drinking other things, not oil. Well, what happens? It starts to mess up, starts to shut down, starts to break a little bit. That robot gets mad at you for this. Okay, that doesn't make much sense, but it does. It's going to blame you for its faults. Now, all of a sudden, that robot kills one of these other robots that you built. What do you think you're supposed to do? Are you supposed to stop this robot from doing it? Of course you are. Matter of fact, if it keeps killing other robots, it's not only up to you to stop it, it's your obligation to destroy that robot. That's us. That's what people have done. So we were told, very simplistically, we were only given one rule: don't eat it. And we did. And then the rest of us have to pay for it. And the rest of the rules have been pretty simplistic. And we can't even follow those. We turn against each other. People will hate other people for almost any reason, it seems. If you lock people into just one city, they'll hate each other. They'll spread off into different gangs and hate each other for that reason. It's not a gang, it's race. If it's not race, it's you have more. If it's not over that, there'll be a reason to war. Always, people find a reason, which is amazing. But that analogy was to put you in the shoes of something that you've created and you've given rules, and that thing doesn't follow those rules. What are you going to do? What would you do to a robot that you invented that was killing others? Of course you would have to stop it. So when you're blaming God for being evil, for putting an end to murderers and rapists and killers, well, yeah, don't you think that would be the first thing that God should do, to judge his creation? So don't be harsh in judging God, because his thoughts are higher than our thoughts. We can't understand his ways because we see things from a different perspective. That's all.
Very good. Beautiful way to end it, brother. Amazing points.
Cool. Thanks.
Awesome. Well, I guess Praise will be shutting it down. But yeah, once again, thanks everybody for joining. This was an awesome discussion. Like I said, I mean, the more Christian creationist warriors that we can get and come together, the better. Because I think we're really bringing it to the atheists and the evolutionists, who I think in the past, especially on YouTube, I know that's why Matt and I first teamed up about a year and a half ago, is we noticed that you could tell that they felt like they had a monopoly on it, right? I mean, non sequitur show, and these guys almost seem to just bully the Christians and the creationists. But now we're building a team of warriors. So I know I speak for Matt as well. We're pumped. We're excited about it.
We should do this again coming up. It was a pretty good, informative learning session.
Let's do it. Let's do it. And until next time, though, guys, we're calling it a night. So God bless.